Iman had learned, somewhere around her second job out of college, that a woman's competence in an office rarely stayed the point of conversation for very long. She was 33 now, a government employee working in a regional planning office outside Detroit, and she had grown so accustomed to bracing herself for a particular pattern that she sometimes recognized it before it had even fully begun. It always started small. A boss who complimented her work a little too specifically, a little too often. Extra assignments handed to her instead of to colleagues with the same qualifications, framed as recognition of her talent rather than what it usually turned out to be. Small favors she never asked for, offered with a warmth that felt, to everyone else in the room, like ordinary kindness, and felt, to her, like the opening move of something she had already watched unfold too many times before. Her first real experience with it had come at 24, in her second job after finishing her degree in urban planning. Her supervisor, a man in his 40s named Kevin, had begun keeping her late under the pretense of reviewing reports, standing closer than necessary when he leaned over her desk, remembering details about her life that she had only mentioned once, in passing, weeks earlier. Nothing he did was dramatic enough to report, not in any way that would hold up if she tried to explain it to someone else. It was the accumulation of it that wore on her, the sense of being watched with an attention she had never invited and could not politely refuse without becoming, in his eyes and eventually in the eyes of the office, difficult. She left that job after 8 months, telling her family it was for better pay elsewhere, which was not entirely a lie, only a smaller and more convenient piece of the truth. She remembered, even years later, the specific evening that had finally pushed her to hand in her resignation. Kevin had asked her to stay behind to help finalize a report due the next morning, which was not unusual in itself, except that when she arrived at his office, the rest of the floor had already emptied out for the evening. He had spent the first 20 minutes on the actual report, and the next 40 on subjects that had nothing to do with work at all, asking about her weekend plans, whether she was seeing anyone, telling her, unprompted, that she reminded him of someone he'd once been serious about years earlier. She had left that evening feeling a specific kind of unclean that no amount of showering seemed to fully wash away, though nothing had technically happened that she could point to as proof of anything. That was, she came to understand, precisely the difficulty of it. There was rarely a single moment dramatic enough to report, only an accumulation of small moments that, taken together, made staying feel impossible. The second time it happened, 3 years later, at a different agency altogether, she recognized the pattern almost immediately, and this time she tried a different approach. This supervisor, a man named Steve who ran the department with an easy, likable manner that made him popular throughout the office, began by praising her work in meetings more prominently than anyone else's, then gradually started scheduling one-on-one check-ins that stretched well beyond what the work itself required. He remembered her coffee order without being told twice, brought her lunch on days she mentioned skipping breakfast, and once, during a work trip, upgraded her hotel room without asking first, framing it afterward as a simple gesture of appreciation for her hard work. Iman had returned the gesture with a firm, uncomfortable conversation the following week, thanking him for his generosity while making clear she preferred to keep their interactions strictly professional going forward. He had apologized, seemed to understand, and then, within a month, resumed the same pattern in smaller, more careful increments, as though testing how far he could go without triggering another direct confrontation, She became distant after that. She stopped smiling at meetings unless it was strictly necessary, kept every conversation with her supervisor confined to the narrowest possible professional boundaries, and declined, politely but firmly, every offer of help she had not specifically requested. Colleagues began describing her, in the careful language people use when they mean something less flattering, as reserved, some said cold. One young coworker, during a farewell lunch for someone else, had said it to her face without any apparent cruelty intended. "You're kind of intimidating, you know. Like there's a wall up all the time." Iman had smiled thinly at that and said nothing, because there was no way to explain, in the middle of a farewell lunch, that the wall existed for reasons the people around her had never had to think about. She left that job as well, eventually, after her supervisor's persistence crossed from uncomfortable into something closer to relentless, continuing to offer unrequested favors and personal attention even after she had made her disinterest unmistakably clear. By then, she had stopped being surprised. She had simply become more careful, more guarded, and considerably less willing to give any man in a position of authority over her career the benefit of the doubt. If you are enjoying this story so far, please like this video and subscribe for more emotional English stories. Now, let's continue. At her current posting, she was the only woman in an office of 11 people, something she had noticed on her first day and adjusted her entire manner around from that point forward. She arrived early, left promptly, kept her interactions brief and businesslike, and avoided, wherever possible, being alone in a room with any of her male colleagues for longer than a conversation strictly required. It was exhausting in a way she rarely let herself acknowledge, even to herself, this constant, quiet calculation running beneath every interaction, every polite exchange, every moment of considering whether a simple compliment about her work was actually simple at all. At home, the conversation was entirely different, though no less exhausting in its own way. Her mother brought up marriage with the persistence of someone convinced that repetition alone might eventually produce results. "You're 33, Iman," her mother said one evening, setting a plate of food in front of her at the kitchen table. 33? Your cousin Hina got married at 26 and already has 3 children. I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because I worry. I know you worry, Ami. Then why won't you let us look for someone properly? Your uncle knows several good families, educated boys, from respectable backgrounds. Iman pushed the rice around her plate without much appetite. "It's not that simple for me." "Because of what happened at those jobs?" her mother asked, her voice softening slightly. She was one of the few people who knew even a partial version of what Iman had gone through, though even she didn't know the full weight of it. "Beta, not every man is like that. You cannot let 2 or 3 bad experiences convince you that every man alive is the same." "I know that logically," Iman said, "but I don't feel it. Not really. Every time I meet a man, even in the most ordinary setting, some part of me is already waiting for the moment he shows me who he actually is underneath the politeness." Her mother reached across the table and covered Iman's hand with her own. "That waiting, that fear, it will keep you alone your whole life if you let it. I'm not telling you to trust blindly. I'm telling you that guarding your heart completely is its own kind of prison." Iman didn't have an answer for that, not one she felt ready to say out loud, so she simply nodded and let the conversation move elsewhere, the way it usually did, into safer territory about her younger brother's upcoming exams or the weather turning colder. What she rarely explained to her mother, because it felt too difficult to put into words, even for herself, was that her caution wasn't only about the men who had disappointed her, it was tied, just as deeply, to what she was actually looking for, a standard that felt, even to her, almost impossibly specific. She had stopped listening to music years earlier, stopped watching films, restructured much of her daily life around her prayers, waking most nights for tahajjud in the quiet hour before dawn, when the rest of the house was still asleep. She had found, gradually, over several years of study and reflection, a spiritual path within tasawwuf that had given her a sense of steadiness she hadn't known before, something that made the disappointments of her working life feel less like proof that the world was fundamentally untrustworthy and more like distractions from a deeper, quieter center she was slowly learning to return to. What she wanted in a husband, then, was not simply a man who prayed 5 times a day or could recite what was permissible and what was forbidden with technical accuracy. She had met men like that before. Men whose religious observance seemed to end precisely at the boundary of ritual, who could discuss the finer points of worship with real fluency while their eyes wandered in ways that told a different, quieter story about their actual character. She wanted something rarer than correct practice. She wanted a man whose modesty extended into his gaze, his conduct, the way he carried himself around women who were not his to look at freely. She wanted someone whose relationship with his faith was not a performance calibrated for an audience, but something private and genuine, carried out as faithfully in solitude as it was in company. When she had explained this to her family one evening, laying out what she hoped for as plainly as she could, her older cousin had laughed and said, not unkindly, Allah si special order Karwana Parega, suggesting she might as well place a custom order with God directly, since no ordinary man was likely to meet a list so exacting. Iman had laughed along with everyone else at the table, because it was, in its way, a fair observation. But afterward, alone in her room, she had felt the comment settle somewhere less comfortable, a quiet worry that perhaps what she wanted simply didn't exist, or existed only in men who were already taken, or who would never be introduced to a woman as guarded and difficult as she had become. Several months later, her aunt mentioned a name during a family gathering, almost in passing, the way such things often begin. A man named Bilal, 36, working as an engineer, recently returned to the area after several years abroad for work. Her aunt knew his mother from the local mosque and described him, with the particular enthusiasm aunts reserve for matchmaking, as quiet, serious about his faith, and, notably, still unmarried despite several previous proposals that had come his way. "Why hasn't he married yet, if he's so respectable?" Iman asked, her old caution rising immediately, suspicious of anything that sounded, on the surface, too convenient. "From what his mother says, he's particular," her aunt said. "He turned down 2 families himself, said something about wanting a wife who takes her deen as seriously as he tries to take his own, not just someone with a good family name." That detail, small as it was, caught Iman's attention in a way she hadn't expected. The families arranged a formal meeting a few weeks later, conducted with her parents and his parents present, followed by a brief conversation between Iman and Bilal alone in the next room, door left open, as was customary. She had prepared herself, as she always did, for the familiar undertone she'd learned to detect quickly, the slight lingering in his gaze, the practiced charm meant to put her at ease while quietly measuring her. Instead, she found a man who kept his eyes largely lowered, spoke carefully and without excessive flattery, and asked her questions that had nothing to do with her appearance and everything to do with what she actually believed, what she hoped for, what frightened her about the idea of marriage. "Can I ask you something honestly?" he said, partway through their conversation. "You seem hesitant, more than most people are in these meetings. Is there something specific you're worried about?" Iman considered deflecting the question, the way she usually did, but something about his directness made her answer honestly instead. "I've had difficult experiences with men, professionally, more than once. It's made me distrustful, generally. I don't say that to make this uncomfortable. I say it because I think you should know it before this goes any further." Bilal was quiet for a moment, turning the information over seriously rather than rushing to reassure her, which she noticed and appreciated more than she expected to. "I won't pretend I understand exactly what you went through," he said eventually, "but I can tell you what I actually believe, since that's more useful than promises. I believe a man's character is measured most honestly in the moments no one else is watching him. What he does with his eyes when he thinks it doesn't matter. How he treats a woman he has no obligation to impress. I can't prove that to you in one conversation. I can only ask you to watch, over time, and judge me by what you actually see, not by what I say today." It wasn't a dramatic declaration, and it didn't immediately dissolve years of accumulated caution. But it was, Iman thought afterward, the first time in a long while that a man had responded to her guardedness with patience instead of persuasion, understanding instead of offense. She mentioned this to her mother later that night, sitting on the edge of her bed, still turning the conversation over in her mind. "He didn't try to convince me of anything," she said. "Most men, when I tell them about my trust issues, either get defensive or start performing extra kindness immediately, as if trying to prove me wrong on the spot. He just sat with it, like he understood it wasn't his job to fix it in one conversation." "That's a good sign," her mother said. "A man in a hurry to prove himself usually has something to hide. A man who's patient enough to let you doubt him and still shows up consistently anyway, that's harder to fake." "I want to believe that," Iman said. "I'm just not sure I know how to fully believe anything anymore, at least not right away." "Nobody's asking you to believe it right away," her mother said. "Just don't close the door before you've actually watched him long enough to know." Over the following months, they continued meeting with family present, speaking on the phone occasionally, with clear boundaries both of them seemed to maintain without needing to discuss them explicitly. Bilal never called late in the evening, never steered their conversations toward anything beyond what was appropriate before marriage, and on the 2 occasions Iman tested him, almost without meaning to, by mentioning something mildly provocative just to observe his reaction, he redirected the conversation gently, without making her feel foolish or rejected for having brought it up at all. It was such a small thing, and yet she found herself replaying those moments afterward, comparing them against years of men who had responded to far smaller openings with far greater eagerness. One evening, several months into their acquaintance, her mother asked how she felt about the arrangement moving forward toward marriage. "I still don't know if I fully trust him," Iman admitted. "Not completely. I don't think I know how to fully trust anyone anymore. Not in the way I used to before any of this happened to me." "That's all right," her mother said gently. "Trust doesn't have to arrive all at once, fully formed, before you agree to build a life with someone. Sometimes it grows slowly, alongside the marriage itself, watered by patience on both sides. Iman thought about that for a long time afterward, turning it over the way she turned over most things now, carefully, from several angles, before allowing herself to settle on any conclusion. She thought about the years she had spent building walls, brick by brick, out of genuine necessity, protecting something in herself that had needed protecting. She thought about Kevin, and about Steve, and about every smaller, nameless moment in between that had taught her to read a room for danger before she read it for anything else. She thought, too, about the version of herself that had existed before any of it, a younger woman who had once believed, without needing convincing, that most people were basically decent until proven otherwise. She wondered, sometimes, whether that version of herself was gone permanently or simply waiting somewhere beneath the caution for enough evidence to justify coming back out. She thought about her cousin's comment about placing a special order with God for a man who didn't seem to exist. Perhaps, she considered, the answer had never been quite that dramatic. Perhaps it was simpler and slower than that, closer to what her mother had described, not a miracle delivered whole, but patience rewarded gradually, one honest interaction at a time, by a man willing to be watched closely and found, again and again, to be exactly what he claimed. In the weeks leading up to her decision, she spoke with Bilal one final time before the families finalized the arrangement, wanting to ask him directly the question that had sat unspoken beneath every one of their conversations so far. "I need to know something," she said, "not because I doubt you specifically anymore, but because I need to hear it plainly. If I marry you, and years pass, and the newness of a fresh marriage fades the way it does for everyone eventually, what happens to the version of you I'm seeing right now? Does it stay, or does it belong only to this stage when you're still trying to win me over?" Bilal considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things she asked him. "I can't give you a guarantee that would mean anything, since anyone can promise whatever they think you want to hear. What I can tell you is that the habits you're seeing now aren't performance. They're the same habits I kept before I ever met you, in rooms you'll never see, around people who have no reason to report back to you about how I behaved. I didn't build this version of myself for this meeting. I've been building it for years, for reasons that have nothing to do with impressing anyone. If that's true, and I believe it is, then there's no reason it should disappear once the difficulty of courtship is behind us. If anything, marriage tends to reveal character more clearly than it hides it." Iman sat with that answer for a long moment before responding, "That's the most honest thing anyone said to me through this whole process. I'd rather be honest and lose your trust slowly if I deserve to," Bilal said, "than be charming and lose it all at once later, when it actually matters." She said yes to the marriage that spring, not because every fear had disappeared, but because she had finally met someone whose consistency had earned, slowly and without demanding it, the trust she had spent a decade believing she might never be able to give again. If you liked this story, please like, comment, and share. More simple and emotional stories are coming soon.